Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Greetings from California. I hope we find everyone safe and healthy and managing during this extremely difficult moment and challenging time. This is Jeremy Martin, Vice President for Energy and Sustainability at the Institute of the Americas. And we're extremely happy to continue at the Institute of the Americas with our webinars. But today is unique because we are launching a brand new dedicated webinar series focused on critical minerals and the energy transition. And we're extremely happy to be able to launch this series in partnership with the Payne Institute of Public Policy at the Colorado School of Mines. And indeed, we'll be joined today by Research Associate Jordy Lee from the Payne Institute in our inaugural joint webinar series on this topic. And we'll have Morgan Bazillion, who's the director of the Payne Institute, make a couple remarks before Jordy, just to also share some background on his institution. Let me do a quick, I think there's a lot of folks who've not joined us before at the Institute of the Americas webinar series and through our webinar platform. We don't use, I think most people are using Zoom a lot these days, and so you're used to the video feed. With our webinars, given the presentation format, we don't use the video, so it's a focus on the presentation, the slide deck that you'll see. You'll see the agenda here in front of you right now. We'll transition that to Jordy's slides once he kicks off his formal remarks. I see a message here. Somebody says they cannot hear audio, so hopefully everyone else can hear. Jordy, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Excellent, excellent. Sorry, Alex, we'll troubleshoot that. Hang with us. But that's a wonderful way to emphasize how we do the question and answer session once we reach that portion of the webinar today. And so what we do is ask everyone to simply type your question during the course of the presentation. You can do it anytime. You can, if something Jordy says on his first slide triggers a question, please feel free to avail yourself of that chat function there. There we go. Oh, everyone's already found it. Thank you. So thanks so much. That's the main logistical question here. Or I should say the main logistical point, how to pose questions. Let me just mention real quickly about the Institute of the Americas, because like I said, I think there are a lot of folks who are joining today who have not been with us before, and maybe this is your first exposure to the Institute of the Americas. And we are a public policy center based on the campus of the University of California, San Diego. We've been in existence for over 35 years, and we were created many years ago to look more at the role of public policy in the intersection with private development and private participation in markets. And energy has been one of the principal pillars and themes of the Institute of the Americas almost from its start, but over 30 years now. And we like to think of our role at the Institute's Energy and Sustainability Program as helping to shape public policy and informing the public on matters related to energy development, investment, and all kinds of natural resource use. So in effect, what we always hope to do is to take an approach to looking at the public policies, the regulatory, the policy environment that may drive energy investment, may drive investment in terms of a whole host of segments of the energy sector. We have 6 principal areas of focus: renewables, energy efficiency, oil and gas, low carbon economies, enhanced regional integration, and stakeholder engagement. And obviously, this topic in this series will wrap up so many of those into the variety of topics we'll get into. So I don't want to take too much more time. Let me throw it over to my colleague Morgan Bazillion, and let me reiterate from the Institute of the Americas how delighted we are to be able to partner with the Payne Institute. He'll tell you a little bit about, but we're so happy because we at the Institute of the Americas are focused entirely on this hemisphere, really Latin America, and what happens in the energy sector and the policy environment in Latin America. And obviously there's a huge role for critical minerals, but what we love to hear from our colleagues at the Payne Institute is the broader global perspectives and just how they at the Colorado School of Mines, perhaps the most renowned authority on these issues of natural resources, are looking at these topics. So without any further ado, I will throw it over to Morgan Bazillion. Dr. Bazillion, thank you so much. Look forward to working together on several more of these. Actually, let me show you that real quick. We've got several of these coming up, April 14th and April 23rd. So everyone mark your calendars for those. Over to you, Morgan, for your introduction.
Morgan? I think Morgan might be having some microphone problems.
Yeah, okay. Let's see if we can try and get Morgan live here. Well, why don't we, Jordy, let's just jump right into your presentation. We'll try and get Morgan to come on, and he can obviously jump in down the road. But I don't want to spend too much more time. Wait, did we get you, Morgan? All right. Well, Jordy, why don't we throw it over to you straight away here? Let's get into the topic, the material and metal security of low carbon energy transitions. And I know you guys have been spending a lot of time, and you've done a huge paper on this. So we look forward to your insights today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for the kind remarks. And yeah, I'm excited to talk to everyone about the material and metal security of the low carbon energy transitions. So just some background for this. It's based on an underlying academic paper that we wrote with some colleagues as part of one of the Payne Institute's initiatives looking at the mineral foundations of the energy transition. So the idea behind it is that renewables are becoming cost competitive. The price of a lithium battery has dropped 80% since 2010. And there's a lot of situations where renewable technologies are becoming much more efficient than fossil fuels. And so they're being implemented across the world. The problem with this is that while the pathway to a low carbon environment is becoming clear, there are still a lot of obstacles and issues that we need to be looking at. And this paper does that by looking at the non-technical considerations of materials for the energy transition. This is because the energy transition will be more material intensive than the current energy environment. It requires a lot more minerals and metals and supply chains and interactions than we see with fossil fuels. So looking at this chart this is a kind of a common chart when we start talking about materials for renewable technologies. You see that for various technologies have a lot of diverse material needs. So we see like 1,000% increase in lithium demand that we'll need for 2050, and 100%, 500% for cobalt. And that's because a lot of these technologies are use materials that aren't commonly mined in large quantities. So if you look at photovoltaics or solar panels, there's 76% glass by weight, but they use aluminum for frames, they use copper for interconnectors, they use silver for contact lines, they use graphite. And same with wind energy from wind turbines. You have 80% of that is steel, and they're huge, and they have copper and aluminum and rare earth elements and 20% of them for direct drive wind turbines. And electric vehicles as well. You see lithium ion batteries, you see cobalt in various aspects of it. And so there's a lot of different materials that go into these technologies, and it's from a material standpoint, it can be kind of daunting to see that we'll need 600% more of something, that we might not be able to keep up with demand if all of a sudden we start implementing these renewable technologies. And it's important to look at these kind of things, but it's important to remember that it's more of a scale kind of thing. So the limitations on material extraction have never been scarcity. We've never had a problem finding sources for different materials, and you might hear quite often that rare earth elements aren't actually that rare, and that's kind of true. You can find them at the bottom of the ocean, you can find them in aspects of coal. So these charts serve a purpose in that they show that it's going to be much more material intensive, but they also show that we shouldn't be terrified by these numbers, because they're not limited by scarcity, but by other aspects. And these other aspects include environmental, social, and governance. So aside from economic limitations, we only mine things if they're environmentally, social, and governed properly. And this is becoming much more of an issue recently, where we see with supply chains becoming much more convoluted than the past. With COVID-19, we saw that a lot of these minerals and metals that we thought were in a good place are reliant on a factory in China selling us manganese or for steel production or various aspects like that. So it's important to remember that supply chains and material concerns are much more limited by environmental, social, and governance concerns. And an example of this is that a lot of developed nations, such as the United States, haven't really wanted large mining operations. You know, if you ask someone if you want to mine in their neighborhood, they're probably not going to say yes. But this is also starting to change in the fact that we're starting to look more at, you know, these ESG concerns. So from a perspective of a developed country like the United States, we're kind of shouting from this mountaintop, you know, telling people that they need to have cleaner supply chains, that they can't be using, you know, child labor or artisanal mining for some of these minerals and metals. And it's starting to become an issue because if you look at places like Tesla and Philips, you know, they're announcing that they don't want to have cobalt in their batteries anymore because they're concerned about price fluctuations from supply chains and concerned about child mining in certain, you know, rare situations. But part of this is also the emissions from these aspects. So we're part of the Coalition on Materials Emissions Transparency, where we start looking at the emissions on the entire supply chain for minerals and metals. And this is a big concern because you know, materials and mining in the extractive industry are a large portion of the emissions that come from industrial changes. So if you look at steel, I think it's 7% to 9% of all greenhouse gas emissions come from steel production. So if we're using those to build wind turbines, which are 80% steel, you know, it's very possible that we're destroying the planet while we're trying to save it at the same time. So it's worth considering that, you know, it's not necessarily the material scarcity that's going to be able to limit us, but these environmental, social, and governance concerns and geopolitical concerns. And with that, if we look at the United States critical mineral strategy, so critical minerals are, by the United States, are considered minerals that are essential for the United States economic prosperity. So they make a big list of these different, you know, minerals that they need for various aspects, including defense, including, you know, different aspects of the economy. And looking at this list, it's pretty clear that the United States is not in a good position. I think the only thing that we net export is helium, but otherwise we have, you know, over 50% reliance on everything from you know, manganese to rare earths to bismuth to a lot of these, you know, essential minerals that we need for renewable technologies and for various aspects of supply chain. And if you look at where these come from, it becomes even more troublesome because it's basically China. So China is the world's largest investor in renewables, but also the world's largest polluter. They have been essential in building out solar and coal, and they added 200 gigawatts of each in the 2010s. And for scale, a gigawatt is over 3 million solar panels. So China's been very, very active about not only controlling the renewable technologies, but also the material supply chains. So this is a list by the European Commission for their 43 critical materials. And if you look at China controls 30 out of the 43. So it's not just that they're doing extraction either. So the E mentions extraction, but P is processing. So China used to be kind of this big mining giant, and they would go to different countries and try to open up mines there. But with this kind of new global climate, you can't really do that anymore. So what China's doing now is they're going through their most recent Belt and Road Initiative. So as the United States kind of withdraws from the global stage, China is more than happy to kind of expand and try to start filling that void. And what they're doing through this Belt and Road Initiative is they're trying to make all roads lead to China. That's the main idea, is that they want to be the biggest processing and manufacturer in the world. And they're already kind of doing that. If you look at this this chart, you see, you know, 87% of antimony, you know, 90% of beryllium. The rare earths are a common one, you know, with 95% of extraction and production and refinement going through there. And so they're this huge powerhouse of these material supply chains, and they're expanding it because they have these state-owned enterprises that can go to these developing countries. Like in the Congo, they can go and they say, "Hey, we'll invest millions in your infrastructure if you give us a good deal on cobalt when you extract it." And it's becoming worse. As it stands, 15% of the sub-Saharan exports go directly to China, and they import 40% of the world's cobalt, and they're the world's largest lithium chemical manufacturer. And rare earth elements are probably the most commonly known because they they own almost 100% of the production and refinement. There is Lynas Corp, which is an Australian-owned company, and Mountain Pass Mine in California, which also mine rare earths, but even in the one in California is partially owned by China. And when we do produce rare earths in California, we have to send it to China for processing, and then they sell it back to us with a large tariff. So it's really daunting to see how much control China has, and compared to other countries. And it's important to remember that these are potential limitations. You know, if China closes its borders for something like COVID-19, then there might be other situations where it also closes its border. We're not able to access a lot of these critical minerals. So another big consideration is how difficult it is to predict the energy future. So if you look at 1990, we didn't have a lot of renewables. 2015 is starting to grow a little bit, but by 2040, a lot of these predictions show, you know, almost half or more than half of our energy coming from renewable technologies. Shell Sky is a very prominent one. It's the same Shell oil company that everyone knows. And while these, you know, give us a good idea of you know, where we're headed, you know, much more renewable intensive and therefore much more material intensive, there are just too many variables to really know exactly what we're going to need. So if you look at, you know, a large portion of renewables in the Shell Sky scenario, does that mean, you know, wind turbines? Does that mean solar panels? Does that mean electric vehicles? And it probably means all three, but it's hard to find the proper ratios. And the technologies are always changing. So right now, crystalline silicon is the most popular solar panel, but, you know, thin film technologies give you a lot of different options that you can start making cool shapes and you can start adapting it. And then for electric vehicles, you know, lithium ion batteries are very, very popular and prominent. But the chemistry of the cathode changes often, you know, and they have different types of batteries for different aspects and different uses. And same with wind turbines are pretty standard because they're not changing that much. But it's really not worth it for when people, you know, start doing these material predictions that they say, oh, we need X amount of steel by 2040 to fund renewables, or we need X amount of lithium. That's not the way that we think that should go. It's much better to have a flexible and adaptive industry that can roll with these developmental changes. So if we have like a healthy mining industry, or a healthy renewable industry, and we have a policy that's actively looking to understand different aspects of the renewable changes, then any one of these scenarios should be you know, feasible. They should be able to be implemented quite easily. And it's, so high prices foster higher demand, but we need to address externalities as well. So that's talking about things like education. So there's not a lot of people that are interested in mining exactly as much as in the past. It's kind of viewed as an older industry. And, you know, that's going to be hard if we go to the Shell Sky scenario where more than half of our energy is coming from renewables, you know, and we have all this material needs. So there are aspects of it that we can control, and there are aspects we can't control. So we can't really predict and control how many minerals we're going to need. What we can control is being ready for these different scenarios and these different energy futures. So in that sense, there's also some geopolitical trends and challenges. So being ready for the energy future means different things to different countries. So if you look at the chart on the right, it's cumulative renewable energy patents against fossil fuel import dependence. So you see countries like China who aren't quite, you know, dependent or independent of fossil fuel imports, but they spent so much time implementing renewable technologies that they're you know, relatively well positioned and they're not struggling. And then you have the United States, who has, you know, is very technologically oriented, and they're very, very prepared for that on that front. But they're also, you know, not quite free of the fossil fuels. And then if you look at the bottom corner, you see places like Saudi Arabia, who are very, you know, famous for their fossil fuel exports, and they rely on it heavily for a lot of their production and a lot of their finances. And so this means that, you know, some countries are better positioned than others. It doesn't mean they can't change, though. So Saudi Arabia is actually a great example of how these countries are kind of being aware of this shift. They're very much aware that renewables are becoming more prominent, and that fossil fuels probably aren't going to be around for forever. So what they're doing is they're partnering with their national energy companies to start looking at, you know, solar implementation. They're transitioning more towards energy than just fossil fuels, and you see that a lot with the private sector as well. You see companies like Shell spending billions of dollars on wind turbines and solar panels in the Gulf of Mexico, and there's a lot of movement towards being prepared, but for some countries it means different things, and it's important to be aware that it's not enough just to have the technology, but it's also important to think about the actual pathway to develop these changes. And natural gas is also a big factor in this, depending on if it acts like as a barrier or as a bridge fuel to different renewable adoptions. But it's important to consider that there's going to be winners and losers for this. There's going to be people that are going to do very well with the transition, that are going to be very well prepared to adapt, and that they can see that the price of renewables dropping and that they can implement them properly. And there's other countries that are not going to be prepared, who have not kind of diversified from their oil assets and from oil interests, and it's going to be a problem. So it's important to consider that the way you navigate the transition is going to affect how well it benefits you. So for this last section, there's I like to talk about the four pathways. So these are 4 possible directions that there's more than 4, but these are just 4 general directions that renewable implementation can take. So there are 4 kind of scenarios that talk about the drop of fossil fuels or the rise of fossil fuels and how it affects renewable technologies. So the first one is dirty nationalism. So this is where elections bring populists to power and the idea of nationalism grows. So people start favoring domestic energy over imports, and they start, kind of fighting against other countries and pushing back. And everyone kind of withdraws, and energy markets kind of fragment, and you start having, the fossil fuel industry gets revived because it's what the country knows and what the country has, and renewables never really take off the way they should, because the fossil fuel industries are protected and they're kept alive. So that one's kind of a dangerous scenario, but we see it sometimes. There is a rise of nationalism in certain countries, and we do see kind of this hesitance towards adopting renewable technologies, and that'll change with market shifts as well. But it's definitely a possibility. The next one is a technology breakthrough. So this is a scenario where it becomes a lot easier to integrate renewables. So some technology change allows it so that we can start having solar panels and wind turbines and electric vehicles much more easily. But what happens in this scenario is that the China and US scale up production and they start competing. And we kind of get this clean tech Cold War, between these manufacturing giants and these large economies that are prepared to start implementing these. And other countries start gravitating towards these. So, you have friends of China and friends of the United States that kind of form this pseudo Cold War with clean technologies. And renewables get adopted very quickly because they're much easier to implement. But some countries miss out, or they're stuck in the middle. And we see examples of this too in a lot of the world. In 2010, China and Japan got in a fight, kind of a tiff about something called the Seneca boat collision, and it's when China unofficially stopped selling rare earth elements to Japan. So there was like a boat collision on international waters, and China claimed that it was Japan's fault, and Japan claimed it was China's fault, and they kind of started arguing, and China said, well, we're not going to sell you any rare earth elements. They didn't say it, but they just kind of stopped, and it created a huge market shift. And that's when we saw the Mountain Pass mine in California open up, and we saw a lot of other countries start looking towards supply chain security for rare earth elements, because they realized if China stops selling us rare earth elements, then we don't really have a lot of options. So the United States and the European Union and Japan kind of formed this coalition, and they're always looking at what they can do to get critical minerals back on track for them, or alternatives. And then you have China, who's already kind of the most powerful material country in the world, and they're just sitting pretty. So that's another possibility, and that's another scenario that is worth looking at. The Big Green Deal is one that I think a lot of people are kind of familiar with in the United States, at least. And the new Green Deal is something that is being actively talked about in Washington, D.C. And basically, it's a global consensus on how climate change can be mitigated, and it develops an action plan. So this is the dream of the Paris Agreement, where all the countries agree that we need to do something about climate change. We need to implement renewables, and they just go at it, and renewables take off, fossil fuels kind of die down. The problem with this is that there's power rivalries, and every country has its own strategy of what it thinks emissions reductions are, or how to adapt to renewable technologies. And we're already seeing the effects of this in the United States. They withdrew from the Paris Agreement, or they're trying to. And the rationale behind that is that it gives India and China an advantage if we have to rely on these emissions reductions. And even though China's on track to reduce its emissions, it's also using a bunch of coal and kind of sending mixed signals. And for materials, this is especially important because there's no differentiated market for green steel or green copper, right? Like you just buy copper on the commodities market. So if one mining company is spending all this money to reduce their emissions and have green copper, have clean copper, and the other company isn't spending that money, then the other company is more profitable. So it's hard to expect these companies to do and reduce their emissions without their competitors doing it as well. And that's the idea behind this, the kind of pushback against the big Green Deal. It's kind of a prisoner's dilemma in that unless everyone starts, implementing these changes, then it's gonna be hard for individual countries to, unless they're willing to be the first movers and kind of take on that extra cost. And the last scenario is the muddling on scenario. So as renewables get cheaper and get more market share, but it happens kind of slowly. So it's not fast enough to mitigate climate change, but it's too fast for fossil fuels to keep up. So some oil companies go bankrupt, others consolidate, and countries try strategies that suit their interests best by not really moving towards an active goal. So we see aspects of this as well in the European Union. They're very environmentally focused, and they're trying to move towards renewable technologies, and that they're passing a lot of laws and a lot of restrictions on what emissions are and what you're allowed to do and what you aren't allowed to do. And it's kind of gently pushing a lot of the industry towards renewable technology. And China is doing their own thing where they have 200 gigawatts of solar panels, but they also are opening up new coal factories. So they're doing both. And the United States is kind of in the middle, in that they're not really sure what we're doing. We have a lot of the energy patents, we have a lot of renewable patents, and we have the technology to do it, but we're not really developing a path for large scale implementation. We're still trying to figure out what's going on with fossil fuels and different aspects of our society. So all of these scenarios kind of ring true if for certain aspects of it, and they all have different parts that we can see in society today. So it's hard to tell exactly where we're going or exactly what we're doing, especially from a global standpoint, because every country is kind of doing their own thing, and they have their own ideas of where we need to go with it. As for what we can do, it's more important to consider that materials it's not going to be a scarcity issue, right? It's going to be a geopolitical issue. It's going to be an environmental issue. It's going to be a supply chain issue with one country controlling all of the minerals and metals. It's going to be a competition issue. It's going to be a lot of things, but material scarcity. And in this sense, it's a multidiscipline approach that we really need to consider. We need to have a healthy extractive industry. We need to have a policy framework that's able to adapt and that's able to make the changes when necessary. We need to be prepared for a lot of different scenarios, and from that comes just an understanding that this is a complicated issue, and it's not that easy to implement renewables across the United States. So if we wanted to do that tomorrow, if we all of a sudden woke up and all agreed that we need to go to 80% renewable technologies or 80% renewable energy by tomorrow, then that couldn't happen. We're not prepared for it. We don't have the infrastructure for it. We don't have the supply chains for it. We don't have the materials for it. So if we want to get there eventually, we need to start considering these challenges and start figuring out ways to address them. Thank you for your time. And if you want for more information, at the Payne Institute, we publish a lot on this subject, a lot of various articles and podcasts. And please visit our website or follow us at thepayinstitute.com or on LinkedIn. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you so much, Jordy. That's a heck of a lot of information. Great job. We really appreciate that. And wow, there's a lot of different ways to go. And I see people have already been able to chime in on the chat function, so I don't need to remind you at all about that. Let me ask you something real quick before we get into the questions here, because something, and perhaps this is just my ignorance, but whenever we hear this term rare earths, could you just take a second to really define what that means? I think you talked a little bit about it, but what do we, when we say rare earths, what the heck are we talking about?
So rare earths are a group of elements on the periodic table. I think there's 14 or 17 of them, and they're used for different things. The problem with them is that they're really hard to process. But they're used for different aspects of renewable technologies and in defense technologies. The most commonly known is probably neodymium for permanent magnets. So permanent magnets are used in a lot of newer motors, so electric vehicle motors. They're also used in direct drive wind energy, and they're used in a lot of, anything that uses a permanent magnet or has a kind of a newer type of technological motor uses rare earths. And for that sense, they're very valuable because they're not produced in large amount of quantities. China is pretty much the only country that's doing it, and they're the ones processing it. So rare earths, there are a couple of, there's a bunch of them. There's heavy rare earths and light rare earths. And the United States produces some in Mountain Pass Mine in California, and then they send it to China, who processes it, and then they get the rare earth metals, and the metals are used to make permanent magnets, which are used in various technologies. So
Okay.
it's kind of an encompassing term for numerous elements, but from the renewable standpoint, they're used in wind turbines and electric vehicles.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you. Sorry, and thanks for bearing. So, a whole host of questions. I'm just going to go through these in order. We have plenty of time here, so thanks everyone for your active participation. And we have a oversubscribed crowd online today, so hopefully we can get to as many of the questions as possible. There's a question about reuse and recycling, and the question is about the demand charts that you've presented, and whether they consider those methods as sources or their improvement to the supply. So the use of recycling and reuse.
Yeah, so I don't think those demand charts do consider that. That's more about primary demand for the up till 2040. There are other charts and other explorations that have looked at it. So that chart is not unique in the sense that it's the only one that provides kind of this future scenario. And it's definitely, worth talking about recycling. But as it stands, the recycling industry is not where it needs to be to mitigate some of these material needs, which is another externality that I probably should have talked about. But it's definitely something that we can look at, especially with these metals like copper is 100% recyclable. Steel, secondary steel is a big aspect. But it's also difficult for a lot of these technologies. So if you look at solar panels, silver is 20% of the material cost to build a solar panel, but it's less than 1% of the weight by volume. And there's no real way to recycle silver from solar panels right now. And we're talking, long lifespans for a lot of these materials. Solar panels can last for decades, and same with wind turbines. So recycling is definitely a part of it. But as it stands, it's not in the place it needs to be. And that's something that we need to explore as a society as well, is to start looking at, getting to a point where we're not relying on this primary extraction and demand. And you see that with other aspects as well, but it's hard to recycle these technologies, right? There's no way to recycle rare earths at this point. There's no way to recycle. Actually, I think the Critical Materials Institute might have just published a paper on how it might be possible. But
what about lithium? Because even looking at this chart on the screen right now, and we all are so focused on the role of lithium in this energy transition for batteries. I don't think you mentioned that in the recycling, and not to spend too much time on this, but I think it's worth noting given this chart on the screen.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure about lithium. I know lithium batteries have a lot of potential to be recycled, and that there's a lot of discussion on what is worth taking out of it. So similar to solar panels, when you recycle lithium batteries, most of the cost comes from the cathode, which is this complex, metal with cobalt and nickel and aspects like that. So I'm not sure if it's worth it to recycle lithium on these cases. And for lithium, it's not really as big of as a scary number as people think it is, especially with the lithium triangle. So if you look at South America, it's Argentina, Chile, and Bolivia are supposed to have 70% of the world's lithium, and for extraction from that, it's in Chile is probably is the only one that has their market set up. But for extraction from Chile, what they do is they get this brine, this liquid, and they suck it up from the ground, and they let it sit in a tarp until it dries out from the sun. So it's not incredibly difficult to extract compared to the previous ways that we were extracting lithium, which was in Australia and other aspects, which was hard rock, where they would have to mine this hard rock and then crush it. So I'm not as concerned about lithium as I think a lot of other people are. I think the number is meant to show a scale, but I also think that we can keep up with demand. As far as recycling goes, I'm not entirely sure, and I think I have to look into it.
Well, we have several more in this series to talk about that. So, cool. Let's. I'm going to bundle a couple of questions here that are related to the role of critical minerals and materials for the energy sector, and then specifically, is there a non-mineral reliant pathway to renewable tech or a green economy? And does emphasizing existing technology exclude other possibilities or the potential to think about other policies? So sort of a broader impact on the energy sector from the minerals and materials, and then more specifically to the green energy pathway that you talked about, and does that exclude some other technologies or possibilities?
So I'm sorry, you're asking if there was a less material dependent pathway for renewables?
Correct. Yeah. There's a broader question about energy in general, and then specifically that question. Correct.
Okay. Yeah. I don't think so for most renewables. So most of these scenarios look at the three most prominent renewable technologies, which are wind energy, solar panels, or photovoltaics, and lithium batteries and energy storage. It is possible that there would be other technologies that could get adopted and that are very feasible for having less material dependence, but for the most part, not that I'm aware of. And I think there's a lot of scenarios that look at eventually having a circular economy, like we talked about recycling, and if we get to a point where we're no longer reliant on the extractive industry, in maybe 50 to 60 years, then these material demands won't be such a concern, even though energy demand is increasing. So that's another big part of this, is that it's not just that we're switching to renewable technologies and that's more material intensive. It's that we're needing a lot more energy in the world. So if you look at this, the energy future, so if you look at 1990 to 2015, we went from roughly over 10,000 terawatt hours to just under 25, and in certain scenarios we go over 45 terawatt hours. So it's not just that we're switching to a more material intensive, it's that we're also needing to supply more energy. So a lot of these countries, these developing economies, are going to start industrializing. So all these countries in Africa, what happens when they start needing electricity, when they start having a reliable electricity grid, and they start having these essential life needs, right? There's places in Africa that don't have reliable energy, and they don't have refrigeration, they don't have heat, they don't have air conditioning, and those are things that are very necessary.
Lifestyle, yeah, absolutely. Modern life, yeah.
That improve your lifestyle enormously. Like, can you imagine, how different your life would be if you didn't have
education,
education, lighting for schools. So it's not just that we're switching to a more material intensive. It's that in general the world is going to need a lot more electricity, a lot more energy, and in that sense, I don't see it being a pathway for less material intensive. Even if we stay with fossil fuels, we're still going to need to expand a lot of these different material needs. We're going to start expanding infrastructure needs and things like that from an electricity standpoint.
Let me jump in before we go on to and look, thanks everyone. This is fantastic. I'm trying to read through all the chat. We really appreciate everyone jumping in on the chat. Let me just quickly pull out a couple pieces I've noted here on the recycling question. And Emily is noting that when you talk about recycling lithium, you have to talk about the chemical compounds to be recovered, and most of the processes make you choose what metal to recover from the cathode. So that's one element. The other, a broader response, and thank you. Let's see if I can find it. I saw it earlier. Was that about the fact that there are actually a lot of lithium recycling or reuse underway in terms of research, but nothing is on the market yet. Sorry, I don't know who put that on there. I read that earlier. So just to sort of close the loop on that point we talked about a little bit earlier. So thank you all very much. This is fantastic in terms of the back and forth on the chat, and thanks, Jordy, for inciting such a lively conversation here amongst our participants. So let's go on to I think a very interesting question here, and this fits right into something we at the Institute of the Americas see as a critical pillar of our work on public policy in the energy sector, and that's regarding what we would call community engagement, stakeholder engagement. Some people like the terminology social license to operate. And Tony's talking here about the role of Indigenous peoples in Canada, and what research and policy development has been done on the land rights of Indigenous peoples in the extraction of critical metals in the U.S. and elsewhere. So if you could talk a little bit about that, it's obviously a huge issue in every segment of the energy and extractive industry. So and I'll before you answer, Jordy, I'll mention and plug our next webinar in this series is indeed largely focused on that topic, in something that the U.S. State Department, together with several other countries, has launched called the Energy Resource Governance Initiative. And we'll talk extensively about that with the State Department on April 14th. But for now, what's your research, or what have you been able to deduce on that subject, Jordy?
Yes, Indigenous populations and kind of Native populations are something that we care a lot about and that we're very interested in. If you look at our interest in supply chains and in ESG reporting, it's becoming much more of an issue because people are becoming aware how big artisanal and small scale mining is from these Indigenous populations, and kind of how the mining industry is in a good position to take advantage. So that was the problem in the early 90s. If you look at the formation of the International Council on Mining and Metals, they refer to the 90s as like a crisis, where they were no longer welcome in these first world countries, and they started looking towards these developing economies. And that's where a lot of our mining and extractive industries takes place, right? It takes place in the Democratic Republic of Congo and other parts of Africa, and these communities are so rich in natural resources, but they're struggling to provide basic life needs, or food or shelter or energy security for their people. And I think I'm not too familiar with what's going on in Canada, but I assume it's the same thing. Kind of these resource rich areas that are struggling to see the benefits of the extractive industry. And it's a complex issue, but I think a lot of it comes back to just having supply chain transparency. So, being aware of where your minerals and metals come from, being aware of what exactly happens, or the practices of a mining industry or the mining company that you're buying from. And I think we're seeing a lot of response from the private sector and investment firms that are starting to be concerned about this. The mining industry is the worst ranked social and environmental risk of any industry, even above oil and gas, according to S&P ratings. And so it's becoming much more apparent that these communities are kind of being taken advantage of, or need to be held accountable. And I think we're seeing a reaction from that. So I think that from a policy standpoint, people are becoming much more aware of these these social and governance concerns. But I think that more can be done, and as soon as we start moving towards these levels of accountability through aspects like COMET, which is a coalition on materials emissions transparency, like the idea behind that is just to be able to provide companies with what they need to report. And you see this from other reporting platforms as well, like CDP and TCFD CDP is a company that companies report their emissions to. TCFD is Task Force on Financial Rated Disclosures, and they're interested in this. They're interested in seeing, are you being respectful to local communities? Are you being respectful to these areas that you're extracting minerals from? And if the answer is no, then these companies are starting to face repercussions. So from that standpoint, I think, I'm not sure if I answered your question, but I think it's becoming much more of an issue these days, and I think the minerals and metals industry is starting to respond.
No, I think it's absolutely, and I think you hinted at some of the issues of supply chain, and just from the general news, we've seen where some of the auto manufacturers are putting pressure on where they get their materials, their inputs. So I think it's definitely something that's continuing, and like I said, we'll talk more about a specific initiative. You mentioned this one that's on the screen now. Let's talk a little bit about policy drivers. There's a question here about aside from carbon pricing and investment in research and development, what do you see as policies that are key to develop the market for these materials? So what could be some of the policy drivers aside from those two she's mentioned?
Yeah, so I think education is a big one. I think we're going to need education and just kind of to stop hating on the mining industry, as weird as that sounds.
Hating on the mine, okay.
Yeah, so they're not viewed very positively, and it's not without reason. They do have some mining companies have a convoluted history, and we were talking about governance concerns just recently, but from a policy perspective, a lot of these developed nations just don't want to admit that the renewable transition is not going to happen without the mining industry, right? And the mining industry isn't going to be able to help unless they're in a good position. And education wise, if we start having automation, we start having these interests in in making them more environmentally friendly and implementing solar panels on mines, and there's a lot of technological challenges that go along with just the extractive side of things. So from a policy standpoint, I think it's worth it to have just to stop hating on the mining industry and kind of being aware that they do have changes, or they do have things they need to change, but they're instrumental in achieving the energy transition. And from that point, it's worth working with them towards more sustainable operations, more transparent supply chains, and more just awareness of what the future looks like. So from a perspective in the United States would be to we have lithium in Utah, I think, and we have rare earths in California, but we still need to implement processing so that we can process the rare earths in the United States, so that we can have less material dependence. We need to start reaching out to other countries that we kind of cut off relations with for a long time, and just start having a global kind of interactive presence, not necessarily on the same level as China, where they're very aggressive about maintaining their trade and mineral rights. But I think being aware of these supply chain considerations and these kind of broader renewable policy concerns is a valuable first step, and then from there's a lot of complex smaller steps.
Well, there's a couple follow-up questions here on sort of the geopolitical side of it. But first, the leadership. I guess you mentioned education for don't hate on mining. There's a great question here from Alex. What is your experience in the mining industry's willingness to lead? Are we truly relying on junior miners to make this transition, or will majors take on this challenge? So don't hate on the mining industry, but as this question, are they willing and able and asserting leadership?
Yeah, I think the larger mining companies are. So if the ICMM is the 26th largest multinational mining companies in the world, and they kind of form that to kind of start separating themselves from these smaller mining operations that might not necessarily be as sustainable. And we're starting to see a lot of interest. So BHP is doing a lot with their Scope 3 emissions and their supply chains. Rio Tinto just announced $500 billion towards reducing their emissions. Everyone's starting to do Scope 3 targets. We're starting to see a lot of responses from these ESG concerns. I think I saw somebody in the chat mention BlackRock, and they announced that they're moving away from high carbon intensity industries and high carbon investments, and and the entire world is. So I think you're starting to see these changes from these companies, and they are being led, and they are starting to become more transparent. So I do a lot of research on the emissions transparency of mining companies, and it's kind of a mess. If you look at this chart, this is everything that a company has to report, from to policymakers, financial institutions. It's very complex, but mining companies are interested. They're interested in becoming more sustainable, right? Like they're very worried that they're going to be next on the chopping block after everyone starts looking at these high emissions industries, because steel is 7 to 9% by itself. So if you start including the environmental pollution from copper, if you start looking at the processing from aluminum, there's large portions of the world's greenhouse gases are coming from these technologies. And unless these companies start changing, they realize that they're going to be next in line for being in trouble regarding the transition. So I think they are doing developmental changes. I think they are trying, but I think the more we become aware of this and the more that we can kind of shine a light on them, the better they're going to do.
Okay, no, there's probably a whole another discussion on that alone. Let's pivot a little bit to geopolitics, and we're starting to run out of time, and I want to try and squeeze a few more questions in. An interesting question here when you mentioned sort of the dependency and the role of China and the whole geopolitical element, and Jamil here has a question about the potential for a North American state-owned entity formed as a vehicle for supporting the creation of a North American strategy to combat mineral dependence from China. So that's a heck of an interesting thought, and I know Morgan Bazilian, the director of the Payne Institute, has testified before Congress on maybe not that specifically, but this issue of how the U.S. and can position itself. What do you think about that? And this is obviously more of a North American, Canada-U.S. posture.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure about state-owned exactly, but I think so the way that China does it with the state-owned enterprise is that having a state-owned enterprise allows you to move to much riskier areas,
Right.
and develop areas that aren't necessarily appealing to the private sector or to private financial investment. And in that sense, I think the United States could benefit from some aspect of that, but maybe not necessarily a state-owned enterprise, but just some incentive for these industries to start exploring this less material dependence. It's because as it stands, a lot of these mining companies, they're coming off one of the worst decades for the mining industry. Commodity prices have been dropping for a long time, and for a lot of them, they're not interested in opening up a rare earth mine when it might fail, or when the government isn't really even saying anything about it, or it's saying that they'll help them, or that they'll have policies that'll help their implementation. So, I think the United States government needs to do something in that sense. I think maybe having some financial backing of some sort, maybe having some incentive is a way to go. But as it stands, the United States is relatively silent on it. I mean, they released the most recent critical mineral strategy, which was the first one since 2011. But in that strategy, it kind of lays out the need for education and the need for permitting and the need for these aspects. But from an actual policy standpoint, I don't think they've passed any regulations or any incentives for these mining companies to start saying like, hey, you know what? Maybe we could start mining some of these critical minerals, and maybe we could stop being so dependent.
Wait, so a quick follow-up on that from Henry. So what government support is needed to bring on the supply we need?
So I think government support of just having more. I'm not sure exactly what type of policy could be developed for it, but the way
we'll kick that over to Jesse Edmondson, because I think one of what he's going to focus on in his presentation later this month in the series will be policy. So we'll table that, as they say, for now, and Jordy. And I see Jesse's got a question here. Oh, perfect timing, Jesse. Hopefully you heard that question, and we'll have people come back on, and you can address exactly the policies, government support policies for bringing in the supply we need. But Jesse has a question about, will there be more value placed on green and socially responsible sources of critical minerals in the coming decade? Will companies go above and beyond to minimize their environmental footprint? And would they be given preferences, assuming their price quality is competitive with peers? So sort of I guess as we saw with sustainable produced agriculture and certified organic and these kinds of things, maybe some kind of socially responsible imprimatur on critical minerals.
Yeah, absolutely, I think so. I think we're already starting to see parts of that with these kind of manufacturing giants turning away from certain minerals that they deem kind of without transparent supply chains, so kind of shady. And I absolutely think that we're going to have a differentiated market in the future. Because a lot of these companies so there's two ends to look at it. There's the finished product side, where these manufacturing companies like automakers, they want to be able to say that this car is sustainable, that this car is made with especially if it's an electric vehicle or something like that. They want to be able to say like, yeah, this is good for the environment. If you look at the supply chain, if you look at the life cycle analysis of this car, this is a car that's good for the environment. And they can't say that sometimes if they're not entirely sure. If their steel came from China, which is 70% coal, if it has elements of child labor in it, then it's not a good look for them, and it's not a good look for the product.
Of course.
And then from the production side of it as well, nobody wants to invest in these companies if they're if you're not sure what they're doing, if they're having terrible emissions, and if they're treating indigenous populations badly, I mean, you don't know, right? So unless you can differentiate yourself, unless you can show that you have a transparent supply chain, like say, and have like maybe a green certified copper or green steel or something, then you won't be able to sell it like that. So I absolutely think that there's going to be a differentiated market, and that in a few years we're going to see kind of green steel, green copper, and that's part of what the Coalition on Materials Emission Transparency is trying to do. It's just trying to tell companies what they need to report on and what they need to be transparent about, so that we can get to a point where everyone is measured on the same scale, right? Because right now it's kind of complicated. You kind of see these mining giants, and they all have different ways of reporting emissions. They all have different ways of reporting their impacts. There's no oversight. So there's no international body that looks at, can look at BHP and slap them on the wrist for doing something wrong. It's driven primarily by financial institutions and investment. So I think the closer we get to something like that, the more that we can start once again just shining a light on these companies, the more likely it's going to be beneficial for us in the long term.
So we're almost out of time, but I want to wrap up with sort of a very near-term topical question. On this, first, a reminder on the screen. So please join us for the next couple of installments, and stay tuned. We'll follow up later today with the recording and slides from Jordy's presentation and all of this great conversation we've been having the last 30 minutes or so. A question to wrap up is regarding the current pandemic and the impact with regards to the topic we're talking about today. Particularly two-pronged question I'd like to have you wrap up with. What's the impact on supply chains given all the responses, the restrictive measures, and all the things that are occurring in so many key markets? What's the impact on supply chains for critical minerals in the near term? And then also a parallel sort of second-pronged question is, are there potential shortages or diversions for medical, and the huge surge in need for some of the medical uses of these minerals? So any thoughts on those two, and we'll wrap up there. And then I'll also remind people to follow the Institute on social media. And thank you again to the Payne Institute. Thanks so much, Jordy, for your time today. Look forward to your final remarks here.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. In regards to the COVID-19 supply shortages, it's not entirely clear what type of shortages or what type of material concerns we might have, and that's one of these kind of wake up calls that we're getting from this COVID-19 pandemic. Is so for the steel industry, there's a bunch of steel manufacturers in Europe and United States that are supposed to be independent, and then China closes its borders, and suddenly everyone finds out that they've all been buying from the exact same Chinese supplier for different steel making materials. So for a lot of these companies, it's not, for a lot of these industries and minerals specifically, it's not, they weren't even aware themselves that they were all kind of reliant on this single point of failure. So it's hard to tell exactly how this is going to impact us long term, but I think it's a very much needed wake-up call for these industries and for these minerals and metal suppliers when they're like, okay, you know what, maybe we should start looking at our supply chain a little more diligently and start being aware of these potential points of failure, and that, you know, in the future, if it kind of has some other reason to shut down its borders, that, you know, the entire steel industry isn't stuck, you know, struggling to find the same manganese from the same Chinese manufacturer. So, and for as far as medical and other aspects of that, so there are ways that the United States can manage this, and the Defense Production Act is a big one. You know, the United States can start incentivizing or start ordering the acquisition of these different minerals and metals, and that's something that I think Donald Trump has talked about in the past, or the president has talked about in the past, and it's a historical use, and it's a very interesting case, especially since critical minerals has you know, been defined, and they're defined as necessary for the economic prosperity of the United States. So as far as, you know, medical equipment and stuff like that, there are options for the United States. The Defense Production Act does give the United States an option to start sourcing these minerals in cases of extreme emergencies, and even for other situations like that, it's worth considering that we have defined these critical minerals as something that we can call upon and act upon in the future if they need to.
We'll have to leave it there. Thanks so much again to our colleagues at the Payne Institute. Wonderful kickoff today for our Critical Minerals and Energy Transition webinar series. Thank you, Jordy, and Morgan, and the whole gang at the Payne Institute from the Institute of the Americas. Thank you, Jacqueline Sanchez, and our whole team. Stay tuned. See you all here online in just under 2 weeks, April 14th, and then again, like I said earlier, Jesse Edmondson, another presentation on policy-specific elements related to clean energy futures and critical minerals. Thanks so much, and really appreciate everyone's amazing participation on the chat. Thanks for elucidating so many of the comments and questions, and adding such great details from all these experts who are joining us today. Have a great rest of your day. Stay healthy, stay safe. Thank you all. We'll share the recording and slides shortly. Thanks again.